There, this is John from Heroes and Legends, and today is part 2 of 6 of our full review of Dragons of Tarkir. And today we're going to focus on the blue cards in the set. If you haven't seen our white card review, we posted that one yesterday, and over the next few days we'll hit all the colors and then do an extra edition for colorless and multicolored cards. So we got a lot to go through, so let's get started. First one is Ancient Carp, and this is just kind of a big dumb creature. The only plus it really has is it does allow you to buy time in some Sultai strategies, and it's a good exploit target if you're using the exploit mechanic. Other than that, it doesn't really have a place to go. Even most limited decks aren't going to want this thing. Next one is Anticipate, and this is a very cheap dig spell. You can use it at instant speed, which is important, so it lets you find answers and also get through your lands late game. It's a very good limited card, and it could possibly see some play in a standard control build as well. Next one's Belltoll Dragon, and there's a whole cycle of these. They're fine limited creatures. This one is a 3/3 flying hexproof dragon, and that's just fine and limited. You're going to play him, you'll be pretty happy with him, but ultimately, he's just very expensive, and his Megamorph is also very expensive. So for those reasons, he's not the greatest limited card, and obviously has been priced out of Constructed. Blessed Reincarnation, and this is a kind of a fun, interesting card, and it's good enough to play as blue removal. This is probably the closest thing you're going to see to blue removal. It's really a polymorph, but then it polymorphs again on your next turn. But it is an instant, so it does allow you to remove a threat prior to combat. And then if by some bad luck you hit something even worse, well, then you do get to rebound and do it again next turn. So it's not a bad limited card. It's much too haphazard to play in Constructed, though. Clone Legion. This is an awesome commander card. Imagine, those tribal decks, sliver decks. This would be so much fun to play in commander. Token commander decks as well. Cost is too high, really, for anything in Constructed, and in Limited, it's a little too situational. I mean, you really have to be planning to have a lot of creatures, and maybe if you have an aggressive limited build with a lot of small creatures, you could use it as a high end to your curve, but in most cases, you're probably not going to touch it. Contradict. This is very simple. It's a hard counterspell that cantrips. That's just fine and limited. Not all limited decks are going to want this, but if you have a especially controlling limited deck, it's going to be a fine instant to have. Of course, it's priced out of Constructed. Dance of the Skywise. And this is a nice limited combat trick. It's a good way to get some extra damage across or defend yourself, basically. And it's a little too situational for standard. As you can imagine, there's just better ways for control decks to get their damage across in Constructed formats. Durgar Nemesis, and here's another kind of big dumb creature, and he's a defender. So a 6/5 defender, but he costs 6. If he costs a little less, I might say he might make it into more limited decks. He costs 7 to Megamorph. The only thing I can see him good for is if you're really running a strong Sultai strategy with a lot of exploit, because he's a good exploit target and he does gum up the ground for you as well. Honestly, other than that one specific case, you're not going to see this guy make it into most limited decks, or definitely not into Constructed. Dragonlord's Prerogative, and here's a nice card. This one is going to be, let's talk about limited first. It's going to be an awesome way to restock your hand. I mean, think Treasure Cruise. I mean, you may end up paying a little more for it late game than you would for a Treasure Cruise, but you're getting 4 cards out of it, and potentially the chance that it can't be countered. So it is a great way to restock your hand in limited. Fantastic card. And standard, I could certainly see this being a card draw engine for your blue-white control decks. And there's tools here. There could be a blue-white dragon control deck. That would be awesome. I really hope we see that in standard, and this, of course, would be a piece of it, regardless of whether the dragons were in it or not. Elusive Spellfist. I like this card a lot in Limited. It has the unblockable effect and can be pumped a little bit through casting non-creature spells. So you get this kind of card that can at least block Morph, if nothing else, and then you're able to get some damage across through some stalled board states. I really like this. Of course, it's a little too slow for Constructed, and again, there are better ways for Control and Constructed to get their damage across. Encase in Ice. And this is another very aggressively costed color hoser, and it's just fine in limited and standard. The only issue is it is a color hoser, so it will probably start out in your sideboard, but when the games come up where you're going to want this against red or green, it's going to be a fantastic card and it's going to do a lot of work for you, I think. I expect to see these cards show up possibly even in modern. These are just really aggressively costed cards. Glint is our next one. And this is good value for limited. Normally, I'd probably say, this isn't a great thing. Don't worry about it in limited. But the reason I like it in this format is there's a lot of removal out there. There is tons of spot removal all over the place. It appears in all different colors. So this is a way to defend your creature, especially your win condition, from getting destroyed or exiled or what have you. So I really like that, the fact that it can come in and save you. It's a little too situational, of course, for constructed, but nice limited card. Good old Lurker, and this is another card I really like a lot. It starts an early clock, it's unblockable, it has a Megamorph for 1 blue to make it a 2/2, so it's a pretty strong early card advantage. It lets you get in there for damage. It's uncommon, so you're going to see him regularly. Of course, the only thing I would caution you about is if you're in a situation where you're drafting, you might start drafting against another blue player if a lot of these guys start showing up. But good enough to be in control and standard as well. I think this could potentially, in the right build, could be a creature that just puts a clock on you early and your opponent has to deal with it. And it feels bad to use a removal on a 1/1 or a 2/2, but you almost kind of have to because this will get out of control pretty quick. Gurmag Drowner, and he's an exploit creature. He's a very good blocker in limited, and he's got a very good exploit ability. However, you do have to build your deck around this. You want to make sure you have some exploit targets. So these are going to be your cheap targets or creatures that are maybe good early game, but not so good mid and late game. If you have those, then yeah, he's a fine guy to play in limited. But having said that, that's very niche. So most limited decks might not want him. He's good when he's good, but a lot of times you won't find use for him. Icefall Regent, and this is a limited house. This may be one of the best limited blue cards, at least creature-wise, that's in the set. And kind of think Dungeon Geist, but bigger and hard to get rid of. And that's Icefall Regent. He's awesome, 4/3 flyer, and he taps down the biggest threat your opponent has and can get in there for some damage. And he only costs 5, which is reasonable for limited. Maybe a little high for standard to make the cut. But if Control Dragons is a thing, he could be the way that deck does its damage. Really fine card. This one is Illusionary Gains. This is an interesting card. It's a very fine limited card. It's going to kind of mess with your opponent's mind and with their board state a little bit, but it is a very skill-intensive card. You do have to use this at the right time. If you use this too early, it gives your opponent a little time to kind of outthink it and find some advantage there. And it allows your opponent to manipulate its effect a little bit. So that's going to keep it out of constructed. But I would try it in limited. Again, not all decks are going to want it. It might not make the cut if you have a lot of good creatures or better control cards, but it's decent. Learn from the past. I'm glad this card exists because it's going to help you deal with delve strategies and reanimation strategies that could potentially have appeared in constructed, although kind of doubt it. But let's face it, this is a very speculative card from Wizards. It's good that it exists. I'm happy it exists. I don't think we're going to need it, but hey, that's okay. It's out there. It sits in your sideboard, basically. Living Lore, and this will combo great with Dragon Lore's Prerogative, and that's probably why they made the card. It's an awesome combo with that. However, that's about all I can really see it doing. So if I'm playing limited and I have a copy of Dragon Lore's Prerogative and I have the space to throw this guy in and just say, hey, we'll see what happens, maybe I do it, but it's asking a lot, obviously, and that's why I kind of feel like this card just feels like a trap. It's very situational. In most instances, sorceries are not that expensive that he's going to be that big and be able to get in for his damage. So watch out for this guy. Don't get fooled. There are times where he's going to be okay, but for the most part, you're probably not going to use him. Mirror Mockery. And here's another cheap way to protect yourself or get extra damage across Unlimited. 2 mana is very aggressively costed for this spell. I really like it. I like the fact that it kind of does all its work on the combat phase, so it doesn't create a like a Splinter Twin sort of situation. You don't have to worry about anything like that showing up. But yeah, really fine card. It's probably not going to make its way into standard control decks because it is sort of overkill. Standard control decks only need a few creatures to really pound out their damage and win the game. They're using control for everything else, so a card like this really doesn't fit into their strategy. Monastery Loremaster. So when he's turned face up, he kind of acts like a super Snapcaster Mage, where you get an instant or sorcery, or an artifact or planeswalker back to your hand. That's cool, but he's very pricey. So even if you don't use the Megamorph, you're paying 4 for a 3/2, which is ridiculous. I feel like they should have gave him flying or something to make him better. And his Megamorph is 6. If you're getting a good card back, that's okay. But really, it's very situational, and I would not feel great about playing him in limited unless I had a really super strong Jeskai build, and maybe I was playing a very heavy mana limited deck. Other than that, he's too expensive for most limited builds and also for constructed. Mystic Meditation. This is an interesting card, and it feels a little bit like some of the cards like Compulsive Research in the past. However, it costs 4, where those cards cost 3. And drawing 3 cards, discarding 2 cards, unless you discard a creature, is a lot different from the other cards of this type where it was either a land or artifact that you could throw away. And that, for that reason, it's going to make it not as desirable in constructed, because blue doesn't typically play with a lot of creatures. They're using the more controlling elements, so it's not getting the same advantage that it would get if it could toss a land or even an instant or sorcery or something like that. But having said that, it's a fine limited card. It's going to give you a little bit of dig for 4 mana, and that's not bad. Not always going to make the cut. If your deck's more aggressive, you probably won't want this in it. Negate. This is a classic counter spell, and it's always good in limited and constructed. I will say it might be a little less good in limited this time around, just because the threats in this set are big creatures, namely dragons. So it's not going to feel great if you got a negate in your hand and they're casting Dragon Lords, but it's still a very fine card. Ojute Interceptor. I really like this one a lot. This is a fantastic limited card. You can pay 4 and you get a 3/1 flyer, or you can Megamorph it for 4 and get a 4/2 flyer. That's pretty significant damage with a lot of evasion. Obviously a little too pricey for constructed, but a really nice limited card there. And it's at common. Ojute's Breath, another good limited card at common, and you're going to see a little bit of a streak of these. And here's another card I want to play in limited. It's going to let me tap down a creature for 2 turns, and then next turn I get to do it again for 3 mana as an instant. Oh, absolutely. So this is awesome. Might be a little too slow for what you're trying to do in constructed, but really fine card. Ojute Summons, and here we go again with another really nice common for limited. It's a 5 casting cost sorcery, and it's basically over the course of 2 turns giving you 4 power in the air. So 2/2/2 flyers are nice. You can joint block a 4/4 with those, or you can start going in for some damage. Really fine card. I like it. Again, too pricey for constructed, but one thing, again, with these last 3 cards in a row we just talked about, you do want to be a little careful drafting blue, because some of these cards you're going to go to maybe in the pick 4, pick 5, pick 6, and it's going to start having you lean maybe towards blue, but other people may be doing the same thing. Palace Familiar, and this is a Jeskai Sage with flying, so very nice common. I always play Jeskai Sage in my limited blue decks in Fate Reforged Dragons of Tarkir, so I'd be more than happy to play one with flying. It's a fine card early, it just gets a little damage across, and then it goes ahead and draws you a card later. Ain't nothing wrong with that. It's a really fine card. Doesn't do quite enough for constructed, but really nice limited card. Profaner of the Dead, and this is maybe the best exploit card, but you do have to do a little work to make it work for you. It's a limited bomb if you have a big creature that you can sack to it. Not very reliable and constructed, and it's not going to work in every limited deck. You're going to have to be very careful what limited decks you put this in, but when it works, it's probably going to win you the game. So pretty cool effect, and another skill-intensive card. You got to know when the right time is to use this, and you got to know when this is the right deck to put it in as well. Quasi Deceiver, and This is only going to have a home in limited decks with heavy morph effects. If you have a ton of morph in your deck and blue's one of your colors and you have this guy and you have the space for him, he'll make it. Other than that, you're never going to see him come into play. He is a fine blocker though, and he does make a good exploit target. So I guess never say never, but he's a little situational. You just want to know your deck very well before you put him in it. Reduce in stature, and I always like these effects. This is another very good limited common for blue, and it's blue removal basically again. Uh, it's this I could see in the right control deck could maybe run a couple copies of this as well, just as removal, just to keep itself ahead. Very good card. Short Crasher Elemental. So he's a limited bomb as long as you're in 2 colors. If you're in 3 colors or more, that becomes a little scary. You got to know your mana base. You don't want to get a situation where he's in your hand and you can't cast him. However, I see him as a standard control deck card. This is how standard control decks are going to work to get their damage across. Megamorph him into a 4/4. He can pump to a 5/3 or 6/2, and he can protect himself. So really, really strong control damage creator, I think. Sidisi Faithful, and here's another exploit card with bounce this time, and he's real cheap. So if nothing else, he is also a blocker and an exploit target. Bounce is great and limited. He's a common, but again, you just want to be careful when you're playing with exploit that you're not damaging your board state. So he's not going to fit into all decks, but if you have some good exploit targets, he's going to be a good guy for you. Sight Beyond Sight, and this is very fine dig for limited. It's at the uncommon spot, so you're going to see it here and there, and it's going to help you dig through at least about 4 of your cards. And it has kind of a quasi scry effect, but it also lets you cantrip and then draw a card over the course of 2 turns. So it's very good for 4. It's not going to make the cut in all decks. Again, it's going to be better in some more controlling decks with a lot of instants and sorceries, but it's out there for you if you have that kind of limited deck. Silmagar's Sorcerer, and here's another really good limited card. And blue's really shaping up to be, at least compared to white that we saw last video, I think is shaping up to be maybe the better of the 2 limited colors. There's just a lot of nice limited cards here at the common and uncommon level, and this is yet another one. And this does allow you to counter target creature spell if played right, so that's a pretty big deal in this format with all the dragons and everything. And he's also just a great 2/1 flyer. Now, he does have exploit, like I said before, you just want to be aware of that, but wow, that's a great exploit ability. So if I have to sacrifice even a semi-decent creature to counter a Dragon Lord or something like that, I'm absolutely going to do it. Now I have a 2/1 that I can get damage across with as well, or I could just flash him into play as a surprise blocker. Yeah, he's a good guy, definitely. Silmagar's Spell Eater, and this is okay and limited. It's a very expensive mana leak. Mana leak's not bad, however, you got to remember it gets worse as the game goes on. So if you're looking at paying 3 to morph him and then 5 to unmorph him, to mana leak, by then it might just be too late. That ship may have sailed. However, there are a lot of expensive cards in the set, so people are going to be trying to force their dragons out as early as possible, so he could still surprise your opponent. He's an okay limited card. He's not always going to make your cut, but he's decent. Obviously, when it comes to constructed, he's going to be a little too pricey. Silmagar's Scorn, and here's a counterspell that is much higher tier, and it's at the uncommon level, but great limited control card here. If you happen to have dragons, it's amazing. It's counterspell. That's awesome. If it's a situation where you don't have dragons, it's still a force spike for 2 mana, and that's pretty decent too. So I'll certainly take that in limited time and time again. Standard, if that dragon control deck exists, this thing is going to be a powerhouse, and this card in itself may make that deck viable. Very good card. I'm very excited to see what happens with this in Standard, and I haven't touched upon it with some of the other cards, but this is another really fine commander card in those dragon decks as well. Allies Teachings. I've kind of mixed emotions about this one. I mean, it's a great late game mana sink unlimited, but I can't remember the name of the card now. There was that one card in Dragons of Tarkir where you could pay an extra mana to get a goblin. It, I tried to use it. It just never did what I thought it was going to do. This is obviously better than that card. So late game, it could be decent for you, even if it got you one or two flyers. It could be the difference in the game. But if you're drawing this thing early in the game, it's not going to feel good. Obviously, it's much too situational for constructed. I think most limited decks are going to steer clear of this unless I just have a really strong Jeskai strategy going on. Stratus Dancer. 2/1 flyer, and flyers are always going to be good and limited, even if they're small, especially if you're only paying 2 for them. So, very fine limited guy. When he's turned face up, he can counter a target instant or sorcery spell. That's not irrelevant either. And his Megamorph cost is still only 2, so he's a very fine guy. You can put him out, counter something, and now you get a 3/2 flyer. That's excellent. Doesn't quite do enough, I don't think, to move into standard, but he's borderline. He's a pretty good card. Taigem Strike. And this is a nice way to break through a stall in limited, especially if you have a big creature, but it is very, very, very situational. So you do want to be careful before you put this into your deck. You're going to want to know that you have a creature that basically is hopefully going to get in for lethal over the course of the next 2 turns, because you may be in a situation where you can't tap them. Maybe you have a Bard stall where if you tap to go in and do half the damage needed for lethal 1 turn, you're not going to survive to the next turn. So there's times where this guy is not going to be helpful to you. Very situational, so he's not going to make it into all limited decks. Just be aware of that before you put him in your deck. And of course, very situational and probably not really useful for constructed. Updraft Elemental. He's a 1/4 flyer for 3, and he's a blocker. He's an exploit target. That's about it. So very small niche role. If you need an exploit target and someone to slow down the game and you're playing that really salty, grindy game, he's there for you, but that's about the only reason you're going to play this guy. Void Squall. Very fine limited bounce. Over the course of 2 turns, you're going to get to bounce 2 non-land permanents. That's pretty good, but it does cost 5, and it does take 2 turns to get the 2 cards bounced. So you don't really see it probably making its way into constructed, but it's fine for limited. Youthful Scholar, another good limited card. He's a 2/2 for 4 that your opponent's not going to want to die, so he can attack in there for some extra damage early game, or he can hold off some morph creatures and protect you a little bit, because your opponent's just going to want this guy to live. And for some reason, if your opponent doesn't respect that, you get to draw 2 cards, and that's a pretty big deal. He's an awesome exploit target in limited. I don't think he'll be a right fit in all limited decks, but for the most part, he's a good guy. It'd be nice if he costed 3, but he probably would be too powerful for 3. So 4, you feel like you're getting kind of a small body for 4, but I think the effect is just strong enough that it really pushes the power level of him. And our last card for today is Zephyr Scribe. And he costs 3, and you can tap him and pay a blue to basically loot. And looting is always good. And the fact that he can untap when you cast a non-creature spell, and you could possibly loot maybe a couple times a turn, that pushes this guy to a nice place. I really think he's a huge mid-game and late-game powerhouse in limited, and he's another one at common level. A lot of times people don't respect how powerful that loot ability is mid and late game, because it's basically letting you filter through your lands when you don't need your lands anymore. Really good card. Now, if you're playing a more aggressive deck, he might not make the cut because you just need that space for more aggressive and more powerful creatures and maybe a better curve. But in most cases, and you're playing blue, you're probably going to play this guy. Potentially, he could even see some play in standard. We'll see. If that control deck's out there, he could be a part of it. So, that's the end of our blue cards. Just want to thank you all for watching. If you haven't had a chance yet, please remember to like and subscribe. Like I said, we will be doing more of these videos. My hope is that every day get one of the colors out, and then of course the final video, and that way we'll be done before the pre-release even happens. So thanks a lot, and have a great day.